Okay. So I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm living and working and coming to you this evening from stolen Wiradjuri land, and I want to pay my respect to Wiradjuri elders past, present and emerging. I want to offer very warm thanks to Lynette and the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre for inviting me to speak with you this evening. I'm a big fan of the Global Encounters and First Nations Peoples Project and its fabulous team, and it's really an honour and a pleasure to share my work with you today. Thank you for David for organising all the logistics, and for Lee for being a respondent, and for everyone who's made time to come here tonight. I know we're all very busy. The Global Encounters Project aims to radically shift Australia's historical awareness by concentrating on the dynamic history of encounter between First Nations peoples and outsiders over the millennium. Deepening our knowledge of encounters between natives and newcomers beyond Australia, but within our world region, has a part to play in achieving this goal. Disrupting Anglocentric and Eurocentric narratives of conquest and colonisation and globalisation. So my work explores how other saltwater peoples in the Philippines responded to intrusions in their territories from sea voyages from Europe and Maritime. And I think it's exciting to put my findings into conversation with your team's work. So today I'm talking about my forthcoming book, Piracy and Empire in the Spanish Pacific, which is under contract with Penn Press and will be out a little over a year from now. I'll start by painting a big picture of what the book argues and why it matters, and then we'll take a deeper dive into the book's first 2 chapters, and I'm hoping maybe you'll invite me back next year to talk about the rest of the book. Okay. Right, welcome to country. Okay. My book is largely a social and cultural history of the Spanish Empire in the Philippines in the 18th century, but it makes sense to start at the beginning of the conquest of the archipelago. This amazing mural by Manila's Guerrilla Collective was unveiled last year in a busy underpass that links Manila's City Hall to Intramuros, or the old walled Spanish centre of the city. The painting offers an interpretation of Manila's history from the 16th century to the present, moving from right to left. We just see a section of the painting in this image. The first scene depicts the idyllic kingdom of Manila before the Spanish conquest. The kingdom's name comes from the purple Nila flower, which you see here, and in Tagalog, Manila means place of the water lily. The man on the throne is Raja Suleiman. He rules a peaceful and prosperous polity. The people who surround him, his subjects, are adorned with gold and jewelry, and they're wearing fine clothes. In the background, we see Chinese traders in Chinese junks, trading blue and white pottery in the background, reminding us that Manila was already integrated into long-distance intra-Asian slaving networks before Europeans arrived. As our eyes move across this mural, we see this peaceful world disrupted and destroyed by the arrival of the Spanish in 1571. Armed Spanish conquistadors riding on horseback swarm out of these tall European ships onto the beach. A Catholic friar raises a cross above his head in the center of the image, blessing this holy war against the idolatrous locals. In the foreground, we see armed warriors, land defenders, strong young men with ripped muscles, raising their campilans or swords above their heads, ready to fight. They load shot into their lantaco or cannon, firing at enemy boats. And we know that they lost this fight. The Spanish seized control of Suleiman's kingdom and burned his walled city to the ground, and they built a new capital above the ashes. I think it's refreshing and inspiring to see such a proud public recognition and celebration of Indigenous histories of resistance against empire, when we know that these histories are so often silenced in Australian spaces. Guerrilla's mural evokes a deeply rooted narrative of Philippines history, one familiar to every school child, that tells how the Spanish came and conquered and ruled by violence alone. The history of the nation is a history of struggle against Spanish colonial rule. This is a narrative influenced by the Black legend. This is the idea that Spanish empire was obscenely violent, and more so than other European empires, and ruled by brute force alone. This is a Debray engraving from 1598 that shows the Spanish Catholic conquistadors murdering women and babies and feeding infants to dogs. Of course, the reality was more complex. A more truthful history of conquest of Manila would show a hybrid fleet coming to Suleiman's kingdom. It comprised a small European sailing ship, a Chinese sampan, and 15 praus that skilled Indigenous craftsmen had built in the Visayan Islands south of Luzon. This small Spanish force was complemented by hundreds of tattooed Visayan warriors. The 1571 conquest of Manila was a Hispano-Filipino endeavour. Manila's warriors were well prepared to fight with an enemy coming from the sea. They had military training and advanced weaponry because the late 16th century Manila existed within a sea of piracy. Polities throughout maritime Asia built fleets and waged war against each other. Raiding rival ships and coastal settlements was central to the political economy of this part of maritime Asia. And human captives are the main prize that pirates sought. The Spanish, who appear as pirates in this mural, rapidly became integrated into this world of pirate war and diplomacy. In romantic anti-colonial narratives of Philippines history, Philippine Indios or Indigenous peoples are reduced to the role of victims of colonial rule, and their only possible action is to resist and rebel against empire. The alternative history that I recover in my book is one grounded in extensive archival research, highlights that local peoples in fact responded to and shaped Spanish colonial rule in much more varied ways, and in many instances supported it. A lot is at stake here. The dominant interpretation of the Spanish conquest promotes a fiction of white supremacy, the notion that Europeans and their superior weapons and knowledge of war and diplomacy enabled them to conquer continents and archipelagos around the globe. This is a fantasy. Instead, the Spanish Empire was forged from below. Understanding the nature of piracy in early modern maritime Asia is key to explaining why so many Filipinos were loyal to the Spanish Empire. My book makes two key arguments about piracy and empire. I argue that piracy encompassed an ideology and military strategies to contain or defeat pirates became an important source of Spanish imperial legitimacy in the Philippines. And secondly, I argue that piracy shaped the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion in the islands. In particular, piracy politics shaped opportunities and experiences of the people in the islands. So it's worth pausing. What do I mean by piracy? So piracy is a term that I borrow from the archives rather than impose on them. And one of the reasons, or the main reason why my book focuses on piracy is because pirates are the problem that made so much noise in the archives. A flexible term in the early modern Pacific world. In this era, Europeans conveniently labelled as pirates their economic and political rivals and anyone operating outside of their own trading systems. This study looks at three successive waves of piracy that threatened Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines. The first was large-scale Chinese piracy, which exploded during the turbulent Ming-Qing transition and plunged China into civil war. The Chinese pirate that the Spanish called Xinga led a huge pirate navy with an estimated 25,000 men that defeated the Dutch in Taiwan and ruled the island from 1661 to 1683. And you can see Xinga represented here in his beautiful emerald robes. The second wave was Moro piracy, or Muslim pirates coming from the southern Philippines and the Sulu zone that expanded in the first half of the 18th century. And thirdly, British piracy, which became a problem for the Spanish, particularly in the 1740s, when George Anson captured a galleon ship in Philippine waters. In 1762, the British Royal Navy and East India Company invaded and occupied Manila. This was all part of Britain's aggressive push into the Pacific. Results in Australia not too long after. The Spanish and their Indigenous allies called all of these groups pirates. What they had in common is that they were enemies on ships who launched attacks on land from the sea. They raided property and seized captives, and the Spanish believed that all of these pirates had the potential to replace them as a dominant colonial power in the Philippines, seizing sovereignty as well as other human and loot. So now I've clarified what I mean by piracy. I'll take a minute to talk to the Spanish Empire in the Philippines. What did Spanish colonial rule in Asia look like, briefly? Oh, this is a quick image of British pirates in Peru when they raided the rich people's homes and dressed up in their fine clothing and rampaged through the city. So we know that Columbus's expedition aspired to discover a sea route to Asia and begin the conquest of the Spice Islands. This goal was not abandoned when Columbus accidentally discovered America. Rather, the conquest of America and Asia, the two Indies, as they were imagined at the time, developed in tandem. Magellan reached the Philippines in 1521, the same year as the siege of Tenochtitlan in Mexico City, which is depicted in this image here. After many failed attempts, the Spanish established an outpost in the Philippines in Cebu at 1565. And in 1571, as I mentioned earlier, they shifted their headquarters to Manila, mainly because this was already an active center of trade between China and other long-distance routes that the Spanish wanted to take advantage of. Manila would be the capital of the empire in the Philippines for more than 3 centuries until Spain was defeated in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. I like this 18th century, mid-18th century map that was created by Vicente de Memije, a Jesuit, and Nicolas de la Cruz Bagay, an indigenous Tagalog engraver, because it represents the Spanish Empire as a whole. When you flip it kind of on its side, you can see that this is like a map of the world with the crown being, Europe, the kind of chest and beating heart of the woman being the Americas, the folds of her dress are the navigation routes across the Pacific, and her feet and sandals are the Philippine Islands. And so instead of being marginal here, the Philippines is represented as a kind of edifice on which the whole empire stands. Manila was the center of colonial power in the islands. It was a walled city, or part of the city was a walled city with big defensive walls that connected around Fort Santiago, which you can see in the kind of bottom left-hand corner, and where cannon was mounted on walls to protect against a pirate invasion or enemies coming from the sea, but also against Chinese inspection. It was a major anxiety. Cannons facing on the Parian or Chinatown. Manila was the headquarters of government and the Catholic Church in the islands. The governor resided in the governor's palace. All of the major Catholic missionary orders had churches and convents in Manila, which acted as center of trans-Pacific and intra-Asian networks that spread across the islands. And under colonial rule, Manila continued to develop as a cosmopolitan trading hub, with galleons linking Manila to Mexico, and the city continued to be connected to thriving inter-Asian trade. Beyond Manila, Spanish imperial power spread throughout the islands in a network of churches and presidios or forts. Presidios included very large fortifications like Zamboanga, which is in the south of the Philippines, and also this kind of tiny natural forts, which were really just outposts on top of a hill or a cliff face. I think they also often took the form as kind of fortified churches, which also functioned in very similar ways. Presidios are manned by multi-ethnic forces. They had contingents of Spanish soldiers, most of whom were forzados or convicts from Mexico. Many were Pampangans or indigenous men from the Pampangan province, a nation that had special privileges from long-term military alliances with Spain that often saw them mobilized to put down peasant revolts and foreign invasions. And also local communities who lived near forts also were recruited to kind of labor in them and contribute to this defense. Colonial religious and military institutions kind of blur at these sites, as this kind of fortified church shows. So people who lived in proximity to these colonial outposts encountered empire in a variety of ways. They were expected to live as Catholics, which involved being baptizing their children, going to mass and receiving Holy Communion, and making confession at least once a year, among other obligations. The Spanish Empire set out to protect as well as exploit indigenous subjects. So people were required to pay annual tribute tax, which could either be paid in silver or in kind in the goods that a community produced, such as rice or wax or textiles. There's also a system of forced labor called the polo, where communities are required to provide a contingent of men to perform labor for a set period of time each year. These workers received a nominal rice ration and nominal pay. Their work included building fortifications and boats for these pirate wars, as well as churches and roads. And labor becomes a source of great tension between Indigenous communities and the state throughout this colonial period. Friars and Indigenous elites facilitated this exploitation. Indigenous ruling class, known as the Principalio, was exempted from tribute from Chile. And the monarch could grant exemptions from tribute as a reward for loyal service to the crown, including as bravery in wars against pirates. Of course, there were limits to Spanish domination in the Philippines. The Spanish failed to control this tall mountainous region of the islands in the middle of Luzon. Multiple military expeditions to conquer this mountainous region failed. Entire villages and soldiers ran away to seek refuge in the mountains. And the archipelagic geography also impeded conquest. And I think the persistence of piracy kind of reminds us of the limits of the empire's ability to control the islands and seas. So for me, the Spanish Empire in the Philippines presents something of a paradox. It survived for centuries despite being surrounded by powerful enemies, despite the extreme distances separating the islands from centers of power, imperial power in the Americas and in Spain, and despite a very small population of Spaniards in the islands. So my argument is that piracy explains, in large part, the surprising longevity of Spain's Asian empire. We'll take a look into this, which I've called Fighting Moros, Forging Empire. It looks at Moro or Islamic piracy. I'll come back to this map, sorry, in the southern Philippines. So the Spanish apply the term they used to denote Muslims in the Mediterranean world, Moro, to describe Southeast Asian Muslims. Moro pirates came from the region in the southern Philippines, or part of modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, that has been called the Sulu Zone. So I've circled here in the map. Moro raids saw fleets, 1,000 men strong, attack villages, which were often fortified. Attacks were multiple-day affairs. The attackers would land on the beach, build catapults and throw rocks and use fire to weaken and destroy defenses. And then they would sack homes and churches and destroy crops, and human captives were the prize they most sought. Raiders wanted people as labor, men to work in agriculture, women in reproductive labor, and also to trade people in the region's growing slave trade. So raiding expands rapidly in the first half of the 18th century for multiple reasons. They include globalization and a changing political economy, as more and more Europeans, especially British traders, are coming to the region to buy trepang and other goods that they can sell to traders in China for high profits. And this leads to a surge in demand for labor that was met by captives who were seized in raids. Ideology is a factor. Islam unifies Moro pirates, or Moros, against this aggressively expanding Catholic enemies, and environmental factors are also at play. There's a mid-century major volcanic eruption, made thousands of people in Maguindanao homeless and pushed them into a life of raiding. In the mid-18th century, Spanish Manila were anxious that raiding posed a major threat to empire. If a king couldn't protect his vassals, then he wasn't seen as a legitimate ruler. He's failing in his most basic duty to protect his subjects. Raids hurt the colonial economy. For villages is emptied of people and crops that can't pay tribute or perform tributary labor. The spread of Islam is also seen as a threat to the Catholic Empire, as Catholicism was perceived as an ideological glue that held this transoceanic Hispanic nation together. And at the highest level of colonial government, there was a fear that Moro pirates would invade and take over Manila and thereby end the Spanish Empire. I think that's often obscured in literature that kind of talks about the Spanish feeling threatened by the Dutch and the British and the European powers, but forgets that they saw Asian states and non-state actors as like the most potent threat to their rule at this moment. So what did the Spanish do about piracy? They pursue a combination of diplomacy and war to neutralize this threat. And the network of presidios that I mentioned earlier is really key, as presidios act as outposts both to wage war and to broker agreements. So I'll talk a little bit about Azimuddin, who became Sultan of Jolo, was the Sultan of Sulu in 1735, and pursued diplomacy with Spain. This is a recent interpretation of what the Sultan may have looked like from a video game Civilization on the left. And yes, okay. So the Sultan was a cosmopolitan figure. As a young man, he studied Arabic and Islam with the Arabs of the Extramuros of Batavia. He was trained to be a diplomat. In his youth, he hosted ambassadors in Jolo, the island where his sultanate is centered, where his palace was. And he went to China on a mission to strengthen the sultanate's ties to the Qing dynasty. When he came to the power, he wanted to end hostilities with the Spanish and increase trade. So in 1744, the Sultan brokers a treaty of peace and friendship with the Spanish King Felipe V, and Jesuit missionaries act as intermediaries in brokering this treaty. This is a mutual defense pact. The Spaniards agreed to pay the Sultan 6,000 pesos and provide gunpowder to fight against their mutual enemies. And that's a very large sum of money at the time. In return, the Sultan agreed to liberate Christian captives or liberate Christian slaves in his kingdom, and also to welcome Jesuit missionaries into his kingdom. So I want to emphasize too that this is a treaty between two kings. You see the Spanish monarch's signature, who signs "Yo el Rey," I'm me the king at the bottom, and also the Sultan's seal. So I think it's important to recognize the Spanish and not interacting with the Sultan as a vassal, but as an equal head of state, a sovereign head and sovereign. So the treaty had some success. In 1746 and 47, Jolo warriors joined Hispano-Filipino attacks on other Moro pirates. And in 1749, things got interesting. Azimuddin and his son Muhammad Israel flee for Manila after the Sultan's brother seized the throne in a coup. The deposed Sultan was welcomed into Manila and ceremony. The ceremony that the government staged to welcome the Sultan very closely resembled the ceremonies they would stage to welcome new governors from Mexico to the Philippines. There were musicians, a procession through the street with big arches in the streets to beautify them. This is a very grand. Azim, during his stay in Manila, agrees to convert to Catholicism. His baptism involved a physical as well as a spiritual transformation. He cut off his beard, swapped his turban for a Spanish three-pointed hat, and he got a new name, Rey Fernando I de Jolo, which you can see how he signed his name here. So he chose is significant because he was named for the Spanish king who defeated the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. The Sultan convinced the Spanish governor of the to return him to his throne, which the Spanish saw as a great strategy to potentially convert all of Jolo to Catholicism and end Moro piracy, which they see as having religious roots. A fleet is organized and sent accompanying Azimuddin back to Jolo, but at Zamboanga, that big fort that we saw earlier, soldiers intercepted letters between and his brother that suggested that the Sultan's alliance with the Spanish was an elaborate trap for these Catholic forces. Azimuddin's ships were searched for weapons, and they found swords and a Quran sewn inside of cushions, and his son was sent back to Manila as traders and prisoners. So the war against Moro pirates to escalate. We see a large Hispano-Filipino mobilized against Moro pirates each kind of season in the 1750s. So the ratings kind of determined the changing winds and the monsoons. They patrolled the seas, blocking maritime routes between the Sulu zone and the Visayas and Luzon, trying to stop it from coming north to the places where Spain had established sovereignty. And these fleets attack enemy boats and villages, and they rescue and repatriate Christian captives while also seizing arms. So this war is a very collaborative endeavour between the Spaniards and Indigenous communities. The Spanish colonial government provides boats that join locally built prows, in addition to artillery, gunpowder, food rations, silver. And the Pueblos provide manpower and military labour. Missionaries, especially Jesuits and elite Indigenous men or datus or chiefs, were go-betweens negotiating the term of these military collaboration. Sometimes they negotiated quite formal contracts that stated that a particular datu or group of datus would commit a certain number and boats for a certain period of time for a number of years, and that would all be very contractual. Who would costs? But there were also more impromptu mobilizations of men, where calls were sent out to dispatch kind of warriors and fleets to meet immediate dangers, such as when enemy ships were seen on the horizon. What was in it for Filipinos? Why fight? Well, elites, as we mentioned, freedom. They benefited from freedom from tribute and personal services, or the polo. They often benefited from royal pensions that were part of these contracts, or yearly stipend or salary. Material wealth was a big factor. Warriors were able to keep a share of what they captured from their enemies, and even though the elite largest share, everyone got something, mostly textiles and slaves. We cannot discount honor. Filipino societies like the Spanish valued military prowess, and feedback from their followers or sakayanes was crucial because switch alliances between datus. My research has shown that many men join these anti-pirate fleets to rescue in. See warriors from the Visayas region in the Philippines liberating captives from their own villages, so siblings and kin. And of faith matters too, these expeditions were imagined ordained missions or a holy war against Muslims. And priests were a very integral part of these military campaigns. They're not only before the ships went off to war, but they would shots. So Catholic Filipinos fought alongside the godly men they respected, as well as families. It's important. Size and Indigenous men splitting through debt peonage. And I've certainly found evidence of coercion, and I don't deny that many men who were convicted of crimes were sentenced to serve in presidios that supplied soldiers to anti-piracy fleets, and there were other systemic practices in place that funnel people into these fleets their will. But we cannot give reasons why that men had to willingly go to war. In many cases in the 18th century, the interests of the Crown and its Indigenous vassals converged to quash this pirate threat. So to my final case study, which will be briefer than the last one, whereas we've looked just now at the entanglement of piracy and Philippines borders, now we'll look at how piracy shaped life in the colonial capital of Manila, paying particular attention to how piracy shaped the experience of the people in Chinese diaspora in the city. So we know that Chinese migrants were a large community. Chinese migrants were almost exclusively male. This in the mid-18th century represents socioeconomic diaspora in the Philippines. There were many sojourners, wealthy merchants, and less wealthy sailors who came and went, but the Chinese were also settler colonists so the two men on the are wealthy. One is wearing a more Spanish style of dress, and he represents someone who's baptized and become a Christian. The man next to him, you can't see the labels. At the bottom, he's labeled as an infidel or a non-Christian person, unbaptized. And it was common in that era. I mentioned before, if you become a Christian, it's not just a kind of spiritual transformation, but a physical one. So the kind of markers of dress change. It would be common at this time for men who were Chinese men who were baptized to cut off their queue or their long ponytail. So this man who's is holding a bag of money, and he's wearing fine silk clothes. We can see that it's kind of shiny. He's clearly very wealthy. Next man, who I don't know if you can see that he's sorry, went too far. He's not wearing any shoes. And the man next to him is kind of like a stevedore, a dock worker. He also is shoeless, and they're both carrying like the tools of their labor. So this shows us that there's that the community is like large and economically diverse. Many of these men from the full spectrum of full socioeconomic spectrum remain in Manila and partner with local women. And over time, we see the emergence of a large Chinese mestizo population islands. In the 7th century, the threat of pirate invasions led to 3 genocidal massacres that took place in Sydney, 1639 and 1662. And at least 15,000 Chinese people were slaughtered on each of these occasions. In 1663, the Augustinian missionary Casimiro Diaz wrote that for months after the last massacre, the water that flowed through the rivers was corrupted with the foul-smelling stink of death. These massacres took place in the context of the rise of massive Chinese pirates so powerful that they captured Taiwan, dislodging the Dutch. The Spanish considered the Chinese Manila 5th column that would join forces to aid Chinese pirates in the case that they attacked. And so each of these massacres was connected to an actual or rumoured Chinese pirate attack. In the late 17th century, large piracy, the chaotic era of Qing and the control over its maritime waterlands. They have a sea where they just destroy within 30 kilometers or so of the coast, and anyone seen living here or trading or being on a boat is executed. Piracy and the rise of Moro piracy presents opportunity for the Chinese of Catholic campaigns against pirates and loyalty to both majesties that they would say on and to the Pope or God, and become integrated into the colony as vassals. In the 1750s, campaigns against Moro pirates in Manila, including through individual and collective donations of money, campaigns against pirates. Chinese participate in public celebrations of victory over reenactments of 17th century Spanish wars. I don't know, maybe I did not. And there's also mass baptisms of Chinese people. These are kind of large public events. And in the 18th century, there were no genocidal attacks on the Chinese. Significant relaxations of laws that regulated Chinese mobility and economic activities within Manila and the Greater Philippines Islands at this time. So wrapping up, I hope I persuaded you that piracy is a powerful lens to look at the history of the Spanish Empire in the Philippines. Analysing the rhetoric and action about piracy or Catholic or anti-piracy reveals collaboration between Spaniards, Indigenous Filipinos, Chinese and Chinese mestizos that was at the heart of the Spanish Empire in Asia and that made the empire so resilient. We also see that piracy had a profound impact on this politics of exclusion in the islands and a strong influence over who could be incorporated within the empire as a vassal and who would be excluded. The next 3 chapters of my book follow the history of anti-piracy through the 7 Years' War when the British invaded and occupied Manila, and look at the aftermath of the war when Spain experimented with kind of reimagining and recalibrating its Asian empire, including by born Chinese migrants from the colony. So thank you very much, and I look forward to Lee's comments and to everyone's feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristie. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move over to Dr. Lee Penman, who's going to offer a few words of comment, and then we'll take questions. Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Kristie, for a really stimulating talk. Thank you, Lynette, as well, for handing over. So I guess I'll start with piracy, huh? So, I mean, piracy is something that's as old as the seas, and people have always liked to think with pirates, those bandits at sea. So they were condemned by governments as the villains of all nations. And during the 18th century golden age of European piracy, which is the period and the milieu with which I'm most familiar, there were stories and legends of the exploits of great pirates, particularly the captains. And many of these are still known by name and feature in movies and as toys even today. And not even the threat of people like the Barbary corsairs in the Mediterranean could limit the appeal of stories of pirates to European audiences who achieved occasionally the status of hero, like land-based bandits such as Robin Hood. In the 20th century, scholars have continued to think with pirates or continue to think with them, though albeit for other reasons. Eric Hobsbawm's, I'm thinking of Hobsbawm's famous book Bandits in 1969, which established the paradigm of social banditry, a way of grasping and explaining the general appeal of pirates and other bandits as sort of repositories of heroic myth, and trying to analyze how their exploits could grant the poor and the downtrodden, in Hobsbawm's words, a heroic self-image to emulate. Following on from Hobsbawm's bandits, you had scholars, other Marxist scholars like Christopher Hill, who connected pirates to narratives of history from below, Kristie, just as you're kind of using them in this talk and this fascinating project. And even as Christopher Hill and other historians have continued to see pirates as offering this view of history from below, others like Neil Rennie have more recently shown that many of the scholarly engagements with European piracy owe a little bit more than they probably rightfully should to romantic and fictional accounts of the 18th century. So today, Kristie has shown still other ways of thinking with pirates and piracy in still other eras, a really broad and immensely interesting sweep of time, but also thinking about challenging the line between rebellion and heroism by examining the status of piracy within the Spanish colonial enterprise. Now, in reaction to this, I just can't help but think of the broader connections to the central narratives that we are examining here in the Global Encounters project in the 21st century, where we are trying to move away from dominant Western narratives of contact encounters and thinking differently, or trying to think differently, about the nature of encounter itself and its implications from other perspectives, from below, from the perspective looking in, from the perspective looking out, and in all other kinds of ways as well. And really trying to move away from binaries of oppressor and oppressed, which seem to dominate, or at least is central to many narratives of encounter. Now, I admit that I had never really thought about seaborne banditry as a potential lens, another way of approaching these kinds of problems. Yet piracy, as Kristie shows, offers a means of rebellion and redress, of righting wrongs or imposing and reinforcing them. But importantly, Kristie's work really shows that there was a spectrum of positions in between, and it's really an exemplary kind of signpost that we could all kind of follow in our work when looking at encounters and characterizing them. Piracy, as Kristie suggests, offers a novel vantage point. I'm not sure how much piracy has figured in prior examinations of empire, and certainly not in this kind of multifaceted history of encounter and engagement. But perhaps, Kristie, you could tell us a bit more about that shortly. But piracy offers this novel vantage point from which to view the politics of the Pacific and the Spanish possessions from the perspective of the various communities that lived there, the Moro communities, the Filipinos, and the Chinese migrants, to say nothing, of course, of the European imperial powers. So, Kristie, I thank you for bringing this to our attention. And maybe, we'd do well perhaps not to think like pirates, but to think with pirates a little bit more as we approach this kind of material about encounter in our own research. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was terrific. I love the question I want to ask, the question that I guess is just so kind of obvious. Who gets to define who's a pirate and who isn't? It's the crucial question, isn't it? I'm pretty sure that, unless you're watching one of those, movies you just mentioned, Lee, I'm pretty sure that the self-definition is not necessarily what we're going by. So we had a bunch of little comments in the chat, mostly just saying how much they've enjoyed it. And Kristie, I can promise you we'll be hitting you up again next year for another chapter of this book so that we can find out what's next. But one of the questions from Turkan has asked, it's incredible how religion is used to mitigate and control privilege and status. I don't know if you'd have a comment on that, but I thought that was a really interesting point you were making, Kristie.
Thanks, Lynette.
And I apologise again for calling you Kristie. It's Kristie.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I'll also take Kirsten and Kristen and all variations. Maybe I'll comment. I'll respond to some of Lee's ideas and to your question, Lynette, and also to Turkan's comment. So historiography, I think this project kind of started as an Atlantic history project and shifted to the Pacific, and I was kind of influenced by, Marcus Rediker's work on pirates, which is very much in the tradition of Hobsbawm, and looking at, pirates. Rediker's looked at pirates in the Caribbean and kind of and like Atlantic coast of the Americas, as kind of is like and the pirate ship is kind of a space that was a radical alternative to the racist and like sexist regimes of British Empire, and pirate ship is a space that formulated ideas that radically challenged empire, including like he argued there was racial equality and more gender equality, democracy. Pirates got to vote on things. Was equal, that prizes were divided up into equal shares. I think that story is like such a romantic and appealing one. I think in recent his book was published, I think Many-Headed Hydra was like 2010. It must have been earlier. It must have been closer to 2000. Sorry, 2000. It's like in the last 2 decades now since that book was out. I think we've have a more nuanced understanding of what piracy was, and in the Atlantic world, we know that pirates are really instrumental in the slave trade. While at the same time circulating information about slave revolts, they're also enslaving and trading in enslaved people. So I appreciate that kind of more complicated view of piracy. And another book that really was very influential for me was a Mark Hannan study, again on kind of the British Atlantic world and British North America, that he looks at kind of popular attitudes towards pirates in the American colonies among white colonists over quite long, like 17th and 18th century. And his argument was that while early on in the colonial era, there's a lot of kind of embed with pirates, and like a former pirate becomes the governor of one colony, or the governor's daughter marries someone who made their money through piracy. By the 18th century, there's much more popular sentiment that's against piracy, and that the British really mobilized that sentiment in a way that encourages support for empire. So that kind of influenced the way I was looking at piracy in the Philippines. And I honestly find pirates when I went to the archive, but when you look at these letters that the governors are writing from Manila back to Spain, or that priests are writing, this is the urgent threat that demands their attention, and that they feel that they are telling us through these archives is like there is a crisis. I don't know. I have mixed. I worry that my book. I think it's important to recognize that raiding was a way that allowed the people of the Sulu a way to remain independent and to preserve their sovereignty. And it was a effective strategy for resisting in Spanish Empire expanding into their land. A lot of there's some interesting studies that have shown that this island of Jolo is an important center of the slave as a slave trade, that they are selling people to acquire guns. So I think like they are we say in English, between a rock and a hard place, and in Spanish have a phrase, between the sword and the wall. Like this is a strategy for them to maintain that independence for this kingdom, and I think it's really fascinating to think about these communities that were also between. They've got the Spanish on one hand, and these like slave raid and these like raiders on the other. Like, what are you gonna do when that's your reality, that your villages are being attacked and they're taking away, attacking a village of 500 people and carrying off 200 as captives? Like you could flee to the mountains or inland, which many people do, or maybe what the Jesuits are offering seems like a good deal at the time, and you're like, okay, we'll build a church and it's a fort, it doubles as a fort, and you'll give us cannon and gunpowder. So I think it's interesting to look at this kind of the complicated reality that people face on the ground, and they're not ignorant, and they're not people with no control. They're just people who had to navigate a very complicated situation. And Turkanas, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, about religion, I think it's hard to know. I remember reading about that Sultan Azimuddin, when he becomes a Catholic, it's contempt within Manila, and there is a dispute within the kind of different missionary orders about whether or not he's sincere and authentic conversion, or whether this is a political strategy. I remember there's one missionary who writes, well, man can never really know what is going on in the contents of someone's soul. And I think that's like an interesting warning to the historian. Like, we can't really know what people really believe, but I'm wary of the kind of view, like, oh, is this all strategic? And they just, there's why am I forgetting the name? This theory of hidden transcripts. It's like it's very dominant in how we understand, James Scott, how we understand what's going on in colonial Philippines. Like, oh, there was this public transcript of like Catholicism, but secretly everyone was rejecting everything. I think it's probably more complicated, and there are many people who did, who were devout Catholics by this time and who did believe in like this holy war mission, and surely others who didn't. And we find archival evidence of that too. So I don't know. I guess it's like being comfortable with the messiness of the situation is interesting. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop ranting.
No, thanks, Kristie. We've actually got a couple of questions. Lily's asked whether or not in your book you touch on the Bugis Makassar pirates, and we've got. Go on, yeah, please.
I think so one of the things I find in the first chapter that deals a lot with is pirates. It's difficult to know exactly who people are and where they're coming from. And I think, like the sources I'm mostly using are Spanish sources, so they include the people on the ground are mostly Jesuit missionaries, and then there are some British sources that kind of also show light. But I think there's like a really great confusion on who is from where, and especially when the Spanish have an alliance with Azimuddin, they're like, who are the enemies and who are the friends, and where are people coming from? There's a lot of confusion. So I would say, I don't know, the answer to that question is people like lumped in together in a way that's not very useful, but this reflects the ignorance of the people whose sources I'm using. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got a question from Campbell McKnight, congratulating you first on bringing so much of the work together, but then asking the question of how do you see your work going beyond Jim Warren's work on the Sulu zone? He can think of ways, but he'd like to hear your views.
So obviously Jim Warren's work, I've actually never met Jim, and I really like to, since now we're both in Australia. His work, or I go earlier, like his work it's really a late 18th century and early 19th century project. So somewhere chronologically, I'm looking at what's happening in the early 18th century and even the late 17th century. And I think Jim just did not really look really at how people, like, I think he paints a picture of Moro pirates versus Spanish. And so I'm kind of complicating those binaries by looking at how this fleets that are fighting pirates are more hybrid, which I don't think he really, seemed like he not acknowledged, but didn't really dive into. I also look at piracy not just in the borderlands regions that are affected by raiding directly, but in the capital, which is also new, I think, and bringing the Chinese into that story. But I definitely, I don't see my work as like contradicting Warren or, but more like building on the very important work and foundational work that he's done in this.
Thank you. Leonie's made the comment and posing a question, saying that she's interested in the thin line between pirates and privateers who would appear to be state-sanctioned pirates.
Yeah. I think that those distinctions don't matter so much in this space. And when you're being attacked by, when your village is being attacked, or when you're living in Manila at the time the British invade, it doesn't really matter if they have the sanction of a very far away monarch or not. The reality of that, what that means to people, is the same, that they are basically in a war, and they're facing displacement. And I really don't I think that people, I don't care much about those differences. I don't think that, because the people I'm looking at they don't see those distinctions. But I suspect that, when the British East India Company invade, they would not be seen as pirates under British law or early kind of international law, because this is like the British East India Company with a letter from the king or telling them to go on this mission. But for the British and for the Indigenous people whose homes they raid and burn, and for the churches they destroy, it's totally these are pirates acting just the same as what we've experienced of piracy, what we've read about piracy. Yeah.
We've got another question from Susanna, and that's asking whether or not these, I mean, really complimenting you on your work, but also asking whether or not these dominant narratives, or are the dominant narratives on history and piracy in the Philippines, are those complexities usually obscured?
I think that I'm interested to see like how the work will be received in the Philippines, because I think there is definitely a school of history that's very different to the church and not critical to the church. And so some places in my book I'm more critical of those relationships. And there's also another kind of very radical post-colonial tradition that celebrates rebellion. And I have one whole chapter dedicated to an Indigenous revolt that breaks out in the context of the British invasion. But I think at one level, my book really is a study of Indigenous loyalty to the Crown. So I don't know how, if that definitely challenges the main thrust, I think, of where Philippines historiography has been going since the 1970s.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know.
Kathleen Neal has asked, or her comment is that in the Caribbean context, she's read Alan Carras on pirates and how they may have constituted a less radical resistance to or rejection of the colonial paradigm, and more of an integral and rational part of regional mercantile political system generated through colonialism. Do you think the Spanish-Philippine example shares any of the features of this? And if so, would it influence the way you read the Spanish response?
Yeah. So I haven't read that study yet, but I should take a look at it. So I guess there's definitely powerful people within this colonial system who benefit from piracy. So these presidios that are scattered throughout the islands, both to put down the ones on the ocean, kind of protect against pirates, and to put down native revolts when they erupt. There are accusations, periodic, there are ongoing accusations that those military officials are engaged in trade with those same people that they are supposed to be fighting against, and making money, like selling wax to the Moro pirates is a claim, that is a case that I've seen, or selling kind of military. I don't know if they receive a shipment from Manila of clothing for the soldiers, that they're selling them to the kind of the groups basically pirates. So that probably would be, I guess that would probably be where you see that quite strong similarities. But I would veer more on, this was ultimately more destructive, especially in the mid 18th century. It really did reach like a point where I think the empire is really alarmed and really see these pirates not only as like, oh, they're raiding, but like they can take over Manila. Like that was a sincere anxiety, and I find that very, very powerful. Yeah.
Fantastic. What a fantastic! I can't wait to read the book, Kristie. I think we're going to be all really waiting for this to be published. It's going to be fabulous. And I certainly hope that we can entice you back again, one of our special affiliate guests. Would be fantastic to hear more of it. Perhaps when the book's launched, we could even have a special event around it. Perhaps do a sort of, a launch event, which would be fabulous. So
you've given me the encouragement to hurry up and get my act together.
Yeah, good. That'd be great. So we have one last slide, which David is going to pop up for us. As I said before, this is the last seminar for the year. It's been a very big and eventful year. The Global Encounters team have travelled to, as I said before, Indonesia, and we've also travelled to Europe. We presented in Amsterdam. We did some research in Leiden. We've been very active and busy all over the place. And obviously we've had our monthly seminars, which are a real highlight for me. I absolutely love them. Next year, we'll be running them again from March to November. The monthly seminars will certainly include next year Professor Jane Leiden and Professor Annie Clark and Dr. Ursula Frederick, who had to postpone their seminar this year because there had been a death in the community that they work with. In September next year, we're going to be involved in a symposium in Jakarta with the Spice Roots Foundation in association with Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency. And they were one of the co-sponsors of our symposium in Jakarta. In late November and early December, Global Encounters team will be co-hosting, I guess. We will be partnering with the University of Western Australia, the State Library of New South Wales and the National Maritime Museum for an event which will be looking at maps and mapping. It's going to be really exciting. So watch our website. It will have all the information there. We also plan on having an event that will commemorate, I don't think I want to say celebrate, but commemorate the 1623 Pera and Arnhem expedition. I keep saying expedition, and we'll be having an event around that at some point, including with the National Maritime Museum. And at a date to be confirmed, we're going to be linking with the History Teachers Association of Victoria for a symposium or seminar at the very minimum, looking at how we might teach global encounters and how we might shake up the high school curriculum so that it includes some of these really interesting things, because although it might be about Indonesia or it might be about the Philippines, it might be about the Pacific, there's no question that Australia is important and plays a role in all of this. So yes, Kathleen, you're right. The 2023 diary is getting quite full already. It's quite extraordinary. So that's really it for tonight. Thank you all for coming along, and thank you for those that have been steadily at almost every one of our seminars rather. Our seminar series is recorded and is available on our website. Please do check in at our website periodically, because the website has lots of information and we try and keep it up to date. We run a blog when we can and little podcasts and things. So there's all sorts of interesting stuff there that's happening. So thank you all very much. Many of you I will not see again this year. So I hope you have a safe, happy, festive season if you celebrate that. And obviously a very safe and happy 2023, and may we put that pandemic behind us once and for all, though I suspect not quite yet. So thank you, everybody, and take care. We'll see you all next year.